Hi, good afternoon. I'll just wait a couple of seconds to make sure that everybody who wants to join does so, and then we'll kick off. Okay, I think we'll get started. So first of all, good afternoon. I'm Laura Rayner. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Centre. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's policy dialogue on digitalisation for the green transition, empowering community action, which is being implemented by the EPC and is supported by the Vodafone Institute for Society and Communications. So as with, I think everyone knows the etiquette, but as with most Zoom meetings now, we're recording today's policy dialogue. But if you want to ask a question at any point, please feel free to add it to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So I'm very pleased to be joined this afternoon by some excellent panelists. We've been joined by Mark Hessellund Beanland, who's coordinator at the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies at the Danish Board of Technology. KNOCA, as it's normally called, aims to improve the commissioning, design, implementation, and impact of climate assemblies. They're the go-to place for people who are needing input on climate assembly practices, and they try to understand the current wave of climate assemblies, find and disseminate best practice, and identify and shape future trends so that climate policy and governance is strengthened through the application of robust climate assemblies. Also joined by, now excuse my surname, Monika Mačiulienė, who's from the CLIMAs project in Vilnius Technical University. We'll find out more about the project later, but in the line is it aims to support the transformation towards climate resilience by providing an innovative problem-oriented climate adoption toolbox, co-designed with stakeholders using a value-based approach, design thinking methods, and citizen science mechanisms. We're also joined today by Anthony Zacharzewski, who's from the Democratic Society. Democratic Society, or DemSoc, as it's often called, aims to create a connected democracy that brings people together in new ways and lets them take part in decisions that shape their lives and communities. Also joined by Kern, who was having a few problems with her microphone, but she's a senior lawyer for justice and environment and European Eco Forum point person for the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee, Justice and Environment's network of 15 environmental NGOs. And the European Eco Forum is a loose network of NGOs stretching from Iceland to Kazakhstan, which has been involved from the beginning with the Aarhus Convention. And finally, last but not least, my colleague Stefan, also from the European Policy Centre, but I'll leave him to introduce himself and the work of the EPC properly in just one moment. I should also say that I'm joining the meeting today from Lilongwe in Malawi. So Stefan is also on hand should my internet suddenly disappear to step in and continue the moderation if I have any problems. So before we hear from the panelists, I just want to, if you like, set the scene. Just turning quickly to the topic, why are we talking about digitalization for the green transition? So yeah, in recent years, we've seen participatory exercises flourishing across the EU. We've seen the urgency to accelerate the green transition grow to meet the climate and biodiversity objectives, and citizens are being asked to play a more active role in decision making. Conference on the Future of Europe was a stepping stone towards the European Commission introducing citizens' assemblies on key legislative proposals as a new instrument in the European Union's participatory toolbox. Countries like Ireland, France, Poland, Belgium, Spain have already hosted citizens' assemblies to discuss and deliberate over climate-related matters. Participatory instruments have multiple benefits. They can contribute to finding grassroots solutions. They can help tackle difficult policy trade-offs and encourage citizen engagement, social cohesion, community action. However, the question today is, what is the role for data and digital solutions such as apps, online platforms, artificial intelligence in facilitating such civic activism? How can they serve as an enabler for people's engagement with issues like the green transition? And how can we bridge the gap between these initiatives and the general population? How do we get more people on board? So yeah, that's what I hope will shine a light on in the discussion today. I will look at how people can engage in the green transition by means of citizen participation, and how data and digital solutions can be used to increase and improve participatory democracy and civic activism. So first, I'll hand the floor to my colleague Stefan to introduce himself and the work that EPC has been doing on these issues. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks, Laura. So my name is Stefan Sipka. I'm a senior policy analyst and an acting head of the EPC Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program. So we work mainly on the Green Deal related topics. And since 2017, we have been working on what is now known as the twin green and digital transition. We started working on it before it was introduced with the Green Deal and the then new now already old current commission, because we noticed that there are these two transitions taking place at the same time, but they are disconnected. So we have the green transition that is trying to, of course, overcome this huge sustainability challenges we are facing, climate change, on biodiversity loss, pollution, resource depletion. And these challenges that are threaten our economy, our society, our very own lives. And at the same time, we have this digital transformation aiming to modernize our economy and society. And these two are happening in parallel and again, not necessarily aligned together. Going back to the Green Deal, we see that that we are at the very beginning. We set up the framework to some extent. I would say that there is more to be done, but at least the basics are there. But it's still to be implemented. And already now, after 5 years, it has been challenged. We have the green backlash, and the question is, what will we have after the 2024 elections? So lots of challenges, opposition, questions around the implementation, who will bear the costs, how much will it cost us, how does it relate to our competitiveness agenda, resilience, and so forth. So despite the fact that there are many benefits in the long run, also for our economy, our society, our health, our environment, there are these questions about the trade-offs, short-term, mid-term costs, who will bear these costs, etc. And then if we are facing these challenges to transform our economy, our society, our lifestyles, what we already noticed, as I said, several years ago, is that we could try to look at this from an innovative, approaches to link them with the green transition and see if we can do something better after. We will have some better outcome without aligning these agendas. So this is what we tried we were been running a number of projects on the links between digital and circular economy, on mobility, on biodiversity, on energy, on different cross-cutting topics, in this sense, information transfer for the green transition. Now we are also running a project on how digitalization can support sustainable agri-food systems. All of these basically aim to explore how can we benefit from these, exploit the synergies, while bearing in mind that digitalization can also lead to negative side effects when it comes to the green transition. So there are two sides of this coin. Now, where does our discussion fit into this? So as mentioned by Laura, we talk about also civic activism, participatory democracy, community action. These developments are important, not just for the green transition, but arguably for the European project itself, to support and advance the European integration, which has also been challenged together with the green transition. Now we're looking more closely how can digitalization support green civic activism in particular. Yeah? And we can talk about different means and tools how this can be done. So why is digitalization important? Just broadly speaking, it can enable data sharing and better information transfer to empower different stakeholders, including citizen communities, to make better decisions, to enable different processes to be involved in these consultations, in decision-making processes. It can empower them also in more concrete terms, talking about energy communities, where citizens can come together and become not just energy consumers, but also prosumers, and therefore help with this shift to renewables, for example. Think about artificial intelligence, apps, online platforms, different ways how this we can share this information and help raise awareness about the importance of the green transition and help make more informed based, evidence-based involvement. As I said, there is the other side of the coin, and that's something that's also happy to reflect upon, how the digitalization can also advance disinformation, and that can actually lead to an increased green backlash if we don't take it carefully. Now, when we talk about the EU policies are important exactly for this reason, to help align the two processes and to exploit the synergies and minimize these negative side effects. And we have policies on both sides, but arguably more can be done to make sure that these are aligned. And this event is part of a larger project that we are running. It's a launch event followed by this more specific discussions. There will be a paper in the end that will be launched at the final event the first half of next year. So this is to kickstart the discussion and see, and building on that, we will continue our work on the topic and building again on our work on the twin transition in the previous years. So yeah, I'll stop here and happy to discuss further.
Thank you, Stefan. Maybe we'll first turn to Monika. Maybe you wouldn't mind giving us some information about the CLIMAs project, what you've been doing there.
Sure. Thank you, Laura. So hello, everyone. My name is Monika Mačiulienė. I'm coming from Vilnius, Vilnius Tech University. And in today's webinar, I'm representing CLIMAs project, which is a 3 years long project funded by European Commission. And the main goal and key activity of the CLIMAs project is to test out alternative tools that stimulate deliberative democracy in climate policy making. So together with 15 partners, we are working on creating a toolbox which will be applied in 3 climate assemblies across Europe. So Catalonian Climate Assembly, Hessellund Climate Assembly in Germany, and Riga District Climate Assembly in our neighboring Latvia. We also have 4 living labs which support the work of the climate assemblies and test out some aspects of the toolbox that we are creating. So in essence, we are trying to scale up the application of climate assemblies in different European regions to involve the citizens in climate mitigation strategies and climate policy making, and to provide them with the tools of how to be more active in these processes. The project started at the beginning of this year. So as probably most of you have a lot of experience with the projects, it's still coming into existence with a lot of discussions between multiple partners on how to do it the best. However, we already had some testing exercises together with citizens. One happened this weekend in Vilnius, where we had a participatory workshop which focused on future scenario creation. And this showcased us the willingness and active participation of citizens. We did not expect that because, to give some context, in Lithuania, we do understand the severity of climate change. However, we have a very cold weather here, and because it's getting warmer, a lot of people do not see it as a problem, which is understandable, however, not really good for the environment. So the climate change is not at the top of the minds of the civil society. We have more pressing issues, you know, the war, Russian aggression, and so on. However, when we started the discussion, and it wasn't a large one, around 20 people participated, people still were active and willing to commit to that. Another aspect of the CLIMAs project is application of other participatory tools, for example, citizen science. And in this regard, Vilnius Tech has a lot of experience in engaging citizens into scientific process, especially when it comes to making changes on a more local scale. So, for example, training the citizens on how to apply citizen science methods to collect data on air pollution, or any other types of pollution in the area they are living, and use that data to influence policymakers to make some changes in different areas. So citizen science is also a key part of our project. I could go even deeper into more details. However, we expect the most impact and activities to happen in upcoming year. So hopefully in a few years, we'll have more discussion in this topic and we can comment a bit more on the successes. However, my hope as one of the leads of the project is to create a set of success stories of how citizens were able to participate and to make change on a policy level, at least to some extent, to showcase for everyone in different regions of the Europe that changes can happen. We just need the tools and resources dedicated to that, and people who know how to run these kind of processes. So thank you for inviting me, and hopefully we'll have a insightful discussion after all the introductions.
Thank you, Monika. Maybe we'll move now to Mark. I wonder from your perspective, KNOCA, your experience with climate assemblies, wonder if you could give us also some ideas of your best practice that you've seen.
Yes, thank you, Laura, and thank you for inviting me. So it's great to be able to see the panel. I just want to say to the ones that I can't see, our participants, that I hope you're out there and with us as well. So let me just give a quick rundown of what we do. I mean, you've already mentioned it, Laura, but of course, I think it's important to say that we're focusing on climate assemblies very specifically, and we're doing so based on what now is about a dozen climate assemblies that have taken place in nation states at national level, and more than 100 that have taken place at either regional or local level across Europe. So our task really is to try to share best practice based on these experiences. And we are very much a collaborative network in that sense. We engage the people who actually organize these assemblies around Europe and try to learn from their hands-on experience. And that's what I want to share some thoughts about. The thing is, climate assemblies are a very specific practice. So in that sense, I represent one particular way of including citizens in policymaking. There are many others, but some of the specificities of climate assemblies is that this method is a method in its own right. Very importantly, it's based on civic lottery, which means that you select citizens to join this to mirror the larger public. We also use the term mini publics often for this. So it's a sortition-based method. I'm sorry if I'm throwing out a bunch of terms here that are not necessarily commonplace, but the key is to understand that what we try to do in these citizens' assemblies, which is different from many other types of involvement, is we try to select people very carefully to look like the demographic composition of the larger public. So doing these civic lotteries is a very essential part of the process, and it gets a different kind of people into the room than you would with a lot of other types of engagement. Another very important part of the method is that it's based on deliberation. So the people who get into the room actually are put through quite rigorous processes for talking together, not just in ways of sharing their initial opinions, but actually debating with each other, getting into depth around the topics they're talking about, which means that the output is not the output simply of the sum of the individuals, but it's the sum of different perspectives from average people coming together. So that's method. I think that's kind of important to say. In terms of when it's relevant, some of the things that this does, I mean, there's a lot of evidence showing that doing climate assemblies, and for that matter, other types of civic engagement, creates more robust policies. So by having people in the room that are not normally in the room because of the civic lottery, you get different opinions, different perspectives than what you normally get. It's not just the people with strong opinions and pre-formed opinions, it's actually real-world perspectives from everyday citizens. It's also people that, through mirroring the general public, create certain amounts of legitimacy for the policies that come out on the other end. So when these types of processes are tied with a good public debate, it tends to legitimize what could be otherwise difficult policy making. So that means that you can use it for breaking deadlocks. And you can also use it for qualifying policies or for giving perspectives on what policies can do. But I think it's important to just mention some of the limits too, because if you don't choose a question that fits into the frame of this particular process, it's not always as meaningful. So not all questions fit. So one of the things that is important to think about is, are you asking citizens to contribute to something within the policy cycle at a place where there's actually a real chance of that input having an impact? It's also relevant to say that a lot of the problems that we have identified that tends to be universal is that one thing is designing a very good interaction with citizens, but you also need to embed it in the process afterwards. So if there's no one there to do follow-up, if it isn't situated within the institutions, and if there aren't someone there to take responsibility for
it. I'm sorry.
Oh.
We
can hear you, Summer, I can say. Sorry, I'll just finish my sentences and we can go on. So basically, if there is not a proper follow-up for how to use these recommendations in the policy making process, then they don't have a chance of really having an impact. So on a final note, I wanted to say just a few things about the digital aspect, because I know that's a focus here. So climate assemblies are not a very digital method, to be honest. It's about getting people into a room together. But digital tools have been used for it. So particularly under COVID, we got a lot of experience with using platforms like Zoom that we're on now. And they work for a lot of things. And it's become common practice for many climate assemblies to do hybrid formats where you do some of it in person and some of it online. But there are two things that are relevant to say. For example, the deliberation, the quality of the dialogue or the interactions with people are not the same online. And then another aspect of the digital tools, I mean, I want to give just one example, because in Austria, they used a specific digital tool called poll.is for trying to gather a lot of different opinions from a broader group of people. I'm happy to share a link to that. But in a nutshell, the thing is, there are interesting tools that you can use to input into these kinds of processes, but they have some challenges. For example, the climate assembly model is very much based on knowing who's in the room and having chosen people that reflect the larger public, which you can't often know very much about the people contributing when it's digital. And it's also focused very much on the deliberation, and many of the digital tools have limitations because it's typically it's not very interactive in terms of dialogue. And a funny thing in terms of this polis and I think many others is that it's based on machine learning, and of course uses algorithms that are not always easy to decipher for a non-expert. So it poses other questions to what kind of things actually get highlighted when you use tools like that. So that's something to get us started. I'm going to just share a few links in the chat, but I hope that's useful.
It is. Scribbling, sorry. There's a lot of food for thought there already to start off with. Summer, maybe I'll turn to you next. We'll check that everything's working with your headphones. Microphone now.
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh,
So yeah.
Oh, how wonderful. I apologize very much indeed for the trouble earlier. But I'm really delighted to be with all of you. I find already the introductions and also the comments from the other speakers really interesting. And I hope later on, perhaps during the discussions, I can dive in more with apps and some good practice examples as well, because I have something to say there, but they don't stem from case law, which tends to be more about lessons learned. So my case law that I will be talking about is from the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee. And I don't know how much of you and the participants know, but just briefly, the convention's second limb lays out the requirements on parties to provide public participation with respect to different types of decision making. So in particular, Article 6 considers specific projects that are very critically important in the context of the green transition. So for example, for large wind farms, they fall under Article 6, and there's a lot of case law there. Article 7 concerns plans, programs, and policies relating to the environment, and things like the national environmental and climate plans that member states must prepare under EU law fall right under that. And to simplify somewhat, Article 8 concerns generally things like legislation, and here laws like climate protection acts, as we see in Germany, would fall under that. And particularly relevant for this talk is the fact that not only all of the member states, but also the EU itself are parties to the convention. And so this is a very relevant instrument in seeing that they actually implement the green transition in a manner reflecting and in fact benefiting from civic engagement. And notably concerning NECPs, these plans I just referred to, the committee already has findings from case C54, putting the EU itself under an obligation to create a proper regulatory framework or clear instructions for its member states to ensure that they actually implement Article 7 of the Convention with respect to their NECPs. And the EU must furthermore adapt the way that they monitor and conceivably even bring infringement suits where violations have occurred. And I think that the committee's case law also has important aspects to look at in this context, because as I can say from all of the countries that I'm familiar with, we all face a considerable pressure to act now urgently to meet the climate crisis, and to do so often at the cost of proper citizen engagement that's seen as an obstacle. And not only does the Compliance Committee's case law show that this falls short of the Convention's obligations, it does us all a tragic disservice because it makes us lose out on these critical benefits, some of which have already been highlighted, like citizen science, which can contribute to a truly green transition. And in this regard, the committee provided an advice to Kazakhstan, which it asked in the context of its obligations for public participation during the COVID pandemic. And there, the committee emphasized that the obligations to ensure opportunities for the public to participate effectively is the fundamental standard against which all aspects of public participation must be measured. And it's a through line for all of the individual little aspects of public participation, whether that is providing notice of the procedure in question, providing the relevant and necessary information to the public in a way that's more of a usable, holding hearings through whatever digital or virtual means are used for this, submitting comments from the public, and demonstrating in a clear and traceable way that the outcomes of the public participation were truly given due consideration. And the committee clearly took the view that digitalization has some powerful tools, but also some dangers to help secure better public participation. So they highlighted, among other things, that social media can be useful in providing notification of procedures, potentially even something directly going to certain people's phones through texts or apps or things like this. And similarly, in its findings and recommendations on C71 Czechia, they said that some sort of social media should be used in order to achieve effective notification, because traditional methods like posts being just placed in the locality where they are, physical posts, signs, or things in newspapers which people don't read, may no longer be effective. And the UK system for identifying the public concerned involved people registering on a very easy portal or sending an email with just a list of some concerns. And that was praised as being a good use of a digital tool to help identify the public concerned, and therefore those people who should be engaged in the public participation procedure. But again, a really big takeaway, though, for our purposes today is that the convention did not cease to exist because of the pandemic. Yes, certain modalities may be needed to be changed, but those modalities chosen still have to meet the convention and be assessed and reassessed and ensure that they're functioning as they should, and that the party concerned had to provide extra support to facilitate and really make sure that the promise of these were used. And in a similar case to the advice to Ukraine, the committee also said that the context of a war did not relieve the party concerned of its obligations for public participation. And again, there may be some changes needed, but the end result is these are still commitments we have to live up to. And I think certainly that needs to be underscored. If Ukraine can do it during war, we certainly can do it as we work to achieve a green transformation. And I don't want to use up all of my time, but I just will leave you with the fact that, you know, these arguments that it will slow down public participation or make it impossible to actually achieve these ambitious goals, that's not well placed. We have cases from the Compliance Committee concerning Holland and Ireland, highly contentious cases about wind farms, for example. And I would say those belong to lessons learned and are to be contrasted with the wind and solar build out in Austria in many cases. There's no case law on that because nobody would be crazy enough to bring a case for this because it was done in exemplary fashion. So to finish, I recommend you look at these cases. There are more. Please feel free to ask me any questions. I think the Maastricht recommendations are also welcome, a very good resource. And there's new updated recommendations on the effective use of digital tools, which were adopted at the last meeting of the parties to the Aarhus Convention in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you. That was extremely insightful, very helpful. Okay, to close the panel introductions, I'll pass the floor to Anthony to give your observations as well.
Thanks very much. Well, I want to reflect on a couple of things that the other participants have said, and then talk a little bit about one of the projects I'm working on, which is called Net Zero Cities and has quite a lot of work on climate democracy at city level, a slightly different perspective now. The first thing to say is that I'm totally in agreement with Summer that the use of citizen participation doesn't increase the timescales that it takes to make decisions. Indeed, I would argue it makes decisions better and reduces the opportunities for people to push back on them, protest movements to unravel them. You know, I often say that if you think it's expensive to do citizen participation, you should see how expensive it is not to. And I think that there's quite a lot of evidence on that, both academic evidence and practical evidence, that the more that you can involve citizens into these big questions early on, the better your output is going to be, the better the policies are going to be, and the more effective the work is going to be as you undertake it. I do think, though, that we're seeing, particularly on the climate side, a lot of political fear at the moment. Obviously, it's a European election year coming up. Everyone's got that in their minds. There's quite a lot as well of sense that there's a polarizing dialogue going on around climate change, that it's all very expensive, and can someone else do it? Can we just not wait? And we're only a small part of the emissions of the world. Maybe it's somebody else's problem. And I think that's quite a dangerous dialogue for a couple of reasons. First, it's quite self-disempowering. It's saying, no, we can't do anything about it, so maybe we shouldn't, which I think is absolutely the wrong place to start from a citizen participation perspective and from a climate action perspective. But also, it's putting people opposed to policies automatically, saying that people cannot possibly agree to climate change policies, even if they have some costs. Where polling evidence suggests, admittedly, a poll is a poll, and it's easy to say something that you feel is socially acceptable. But polling evidence suggests that people are genuinely worried about climate change. They do see it as one of the big issues facing society, and they are ready to pay a price as long as they think it's fair. And for me, the fairness comes from demonstrating that the work has been done in the open and with the public. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Net Zero Cities. It's a part of the EU Cities mission. In fact, it's the platform of the EU Cities mission. 112 cities, 100 inside the EU and 12 outside, have been selected as mission cities from the 350 that applied. And each one of them gets some funding, actually not that much in city budget scale, like £1.5 million euros, really not much, to support the creation of a transition team. And that transition team undertakes to take the city towards net zero by 2030. Now, the cities have been selected to be a really diverse group so that we're trying to get all of the learning we can out of the mix of cities we're working with. So I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone if all of them don't reach net zero by 2030, given that some of them are starting where Sarajevo is and others are starting where Copenhagen is, and those are two totally different places. But at the same time, the thing that I think is really interesting from our perspective is that we are addressing through the city work exactly the kind of long-term challenges, like the 10-year, 15-year challenges that both climate change and digitalization are bringing about. And we're trying to do it with citizen engagement as a fundamental part of the program. So each city has to produce a climate city action plan, a climate city contract. There's no legal recourse if you don't meet it, but it's designed to be a statement of commitments. And in that, you have citizen participation and public engagement and new forms of governance as one of the elements that you have to fulfill. So as well as electrifying your bus fleet, re-insulating your houses, doing all of the practical technical things that you need to do, there's a real commitment to matching the financial and technical innovation with social and democratic innovation. And for me, that's one of the most important parts of the program, because it's allowed us as well to see where cities are in some of this thinking. Each of the cities has been asked to undertake a set of self-assessment processes called strategic needs assessment, try to understand like where are the things that they want to work on the most. And of 112 cities in the program, 111 said that one of the areas they really needed support with was on citizen participation around climate change. 112 was presumably absolutely fine, they had nothing to worry about. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities there, because when we start to talk to these cities in detail, you can see that a lot of them know a lot more about their communities than they think they do, and that people differently elsewhere in the organization have really already started to engage on some of these questions. It's trying to understand how we create something that is bigger than an individual assembly or an individual exercise, and how we build out a democratic infrastructure for managing these long-term transitions. Because to some extent, the purpose of the work that we're doing in cities is to depoliticize climate change, not to say, oh, it has to happen no matter what politics says, but to make sure that the maximum coalition is being brought together, and that the things that people need to do, or things that cities need to do to achieve that net zero target, are seen as a common approach, as something that we're working on together, and that the politics can shape the direction a little bit, it can shape around the edges, but the fundamental direction of travel is really clear and is supported by a broad consensus of the public. I think the climate assemblies that we've had so far have been really good at setting those big strategies, but we're now interestingly in a position where a lot of the strategies have been set, a lot of the carbon budgets are understood, a lot of the pathways, the possible pathways are there to be selected. And now it's time for harder choices. So it's been very interesting to watch the cities move from this big strategy setting, like declaring a climate emergency is like, it's not that hard. Writing a big strategy to say all the things that need to be done is like, it's a bit more difficult, but like it's manageable, you can fudge it a bit. Doing all the analysis to say where the most important carbon targets are. Again, you know, it's just statistics, it's fine. And then suddenly it comes down to, we're going to have to ask people in poor neighborhoods to re-insulate their homes. How can we help them do that? We're going to need to electrify the network. How can we help that happen? We're going to need to take cars off the streets in the city centre. What happens when we do that? And all of these questions are coming up all at once. So they are being seen as this huge challenge to cities that are coming at them from all directions. And each one of them has their own little group of people who are really annoyed about it. So it's very important in our approach to understand the transition map that you have for democratic participation as well. To understand, what do you do well? What don't you do well? Where could you do more? And most importantly, who are your allies in the community who can help you work on this? Because if this comes only from the city and only from the centre, it's never going to work, which is one of the reasons why our transition team model starts with a cross-sectoral team, including civil society actors, including public enterprises, businesses, and also other public services, to try to get as wide a conversation as possible going. Now, not everywhere is very far down the track on that. If you want to see one that's really working, I can definitely suggest popping up the road from Brussels to look at Leuven in Brabant, where the Leuven 2030 partnership, which was set up a couple of years ahead of net zero cities in this kind of one of our models, has been doing some really excellent work in the first round of reforms and initiatives, and now starting to build towards net zero. So very much recommend that as a good model. So I don't want to go on for too long. I think the key points I'd add to this are, digital is an essential part of building this democratic participation exercise, even at local level. Now, you might associate local participation with people turning up in a drafty public hall to listen to speakers from the stage, but actually it's equally important to keep them connected in between meetings, and it's equally important to make sure they have access to the information they need to express their opinion and to share their judgment. And digital tools are really the best way to do that in an era where newspapers are not providing or not able to provide anymore the local level of information services they used to. So we need to make sure that those digital spaces are safe and that they're reliable and that the information that goes through them is reliable as well. And obviously we're seeing some pretty bad signs in that respect. So one of the things we're working on in a separate project is to understand how we can use digital technologies to increase the reliability and the trust that people have in information and build out broader networks of trust around these pieces of information. That's unrelated to the Net Zero Cities project, but I think it's really important that these two reinforce each other. Second thing to say is we shouldn't be doing citizen engagement work that doesn't contribute to building democratic infrastructure. We shouldn't be running a citizens' assembly and then forgetting about it, as I'm sure Mark would agree. We should be doing something that feeds into a process, that feeds into something that lasts over the long term, because all of these things build on each other, or if they can build on each other, we can end up with something where the city council and decision makers in the city expect to use public voice, expect to use citizen input. It just becomes something that's normalized. And similarly, citizens expect to be asked and expect to have a responsibility for giving good information and for participating. So that kind of positive circle is one we're really trying to build up. And the third thing to say is there's a really interesting possibility that we're starting to explore through Net Zero Cities for European and national conversations to be influenced by some of these local ones. So one of the first things you see when you come to these events is a lot of people say, well, we can't do that because the government won't let us, or we can't do that because Europe won't. Well, that's true often. So how can we tell government and how can we tell Europe that this is what should happen? And how can we tell people at local level when there's an opportunity to influence those policies that are being made at European and national level that may look really boring and dull in the page 7 of the Financial Times, but actually are really essential in affecting what you'll be able to choose and the choices you'll be able to make in the next few years. So the policymaking section of Net Zero Cities is looking specifically at how to build two-way connections between the citizen engagement work that we're doing in cities and the policymaking space at national and European level. Very, very early days. That piece of the project only really started on the 1st of September, but I'm really excited about it because for me, multi-level governance on climate and on digital are going to be absolutely essential if we're going to build a better citizen conversation at every level to take on some of these enormously challenging long-term decisions. Thank you.
I have a long list of questions already. So yeah, get ready. But maybe just to start, yeah, I wonder if you could all give a very brief view on what you think the current state of play is around citizen involvement, citizen participatory policy making at European level. Where are we at the moment, considering, as you've mentioned, most of you, there is a sense of pushback, at least from political leaders, if not from citizens, because as you said, the polling, at least it's polling, but it is quite clear often that people want to see action on climate and biodiversity. So yeah, I just wonder if you could give really a top-line assessment of where you think things are at this stage. Maybe start with you, Monika.
Okay, thank you for your question, Laura. I think it's varied. So definitely not, there's no country where the engagement is like top-notch and everybody is engaged in discussing the climate topics. However, there are some countries which have more advanced approaches and already implemented approaches like climate assemblies, and it depends on the context of implementation and the cultural and political traditions that the country has. I can mostly comment on my own nation, so Lithuania, where the engagement of citizens is not an active approach and not very intensely approached or organized. And this is because of the historical background that we have and long years of occupation limited the trust in the society between different members and between different citizens. So people are usually quite concerned and reserved about participation. However, of course, this is changing. We have new generation growing up, which grew up in a democratic society and have a very different approach. So I think this will change. But we have, of course, different stories around Europe, and maybe our colleagues here in the panel can comment on them a bit more, where the progress is a bit achieved more.
Yeah, Mark, maybe indeed this is your specialty.
Well, that it's a challenge to actually ask or answer this in a concise and comprehensible way. I think the thing is we experienced that there's a lot of experimentation on asking citizens or engaging citizens in various questions now. So climate assemblies are good examples. We also started by mentioning the conference on the future of Europe. And on all levels of policymaking, I think there are experimentations being done with trying to include the voices of citizens. The thing is, and I think this is kind of an important point, is that if you involve or engage citizens in a good way, you can't, of course, know what the outcome is going to be. It'll be dependent on the citizens, and it'll be defined by the citizens. So if you organize good involvement with citizens, you can't know exactly what the outcome will be. The thing is, however, that consistently we see evidence that when climate assemblies are hosted, for example, they come out with more ambitious policies than what is currently being organized by policymakers. So the funny thing is, I don't think that has to do with the fact that citizens are necessarily bound to create a progressive answer to agendas like climate change. I think it's more probably a question of the fact that certain policymakers are still behind in terms of what the general population wants to have happening. But I think it's important to say in this conversation that there's no quick fix for this. I think if you want to use some sort of engagement methodologies, be they in person or digital, you can't order an outcome, but you can create dialogue that gives a more realistic representation of what citizens actually think. And for this particular topic, for the green transition, for climate change, it's seemingly very clear that people out there are more interested in having action than what is currently reflected on any policy level.
Sorry, I can't write and moderate at the same time. I'll have to come back and watch everything afterwards. Yeah, Summer, maybe the same question to you.
Sure. I like how Monika started off saying that, well, I think that there's a varied view. I first speaking, so as I said, Justice Environment, or as you introduced me, we have 15 member organizations, 13 of which are in the EU. And for example, they're all very engaged in the process of these developing these national environment and climate plans. And there, and quite in general, we see a major pushback for citizen engagement, and that there are new and new restrictions constantly inserted into our laws regarding environmental impact assessment or elsewhere, which reduce our rights for effective engagement. This despite, as I believe Anthony suggested, that we have massive events. I mean, in my Austria alone, we have wonderful success stories, which I can talk about, I think one of which is very relevant for today, showing how it speeds up the process, leads to better governance and better, better decision making, et cetera. Last thing I'll say on the negative view of it is something that's commonly misunderstood. That is, I think was it Mark? You just said, well, if you involve the public, you don't know what the outcome will be. That's not entirely true, at least as with regards to certain decision making. So if it's under Article 6 or Article 7 or Article 8 of the Convention, the public has no veto right. So they can provide their input, and the public authorities have a duty to show that they took into consideration the outcome of that public participation. But the public cannot say, we just veto this, period. They can use the information that they gathered through this participation process to say, we think independently what you're proposing is illegal, and bring it to court. That's different, but they don't have a veto right. But as I think both of the other speakers, all of them emphasized, things like the Climate Assembly, Conference for Future of Europe, these issues happening at the municipal level, I think, are also a really important other form of engaging and affirming citizen engagement in a way. And I think it should be brought up all the levels of governance. I think also the mayors in all over the world are driving forces, particularly as regards to climate and facing the triple threat. So I think that's good. So it's a mixed bag, but for the area of my work that I'm involved in, it's particularly dire now and requires us to be very vigilant.
Anthony, are you going to be as pessimistic?
Well, I should first say that I'm in a corridor at another meeting, and there's coffee going on, so I apologize in advance if there's some background noise. I think the answer is I'm not going to be pessimistic, but I do think that there is a need for us to have a certain degree of courage. I think it's quite easy at the moment when the initial kind of rush of enthusiasm for new approaches and things like citizens' assemblies has passed, and we've moved into the more challenging, more boring part of like building the longer term structures and having longer term conversations. Quite easy to lose momentum and to feel like you aren't able to make things move forward fast enough, or that the crisis is running ahead of it. Well, I think it's really important to remember a few things. The first is that there is an enormous amount of activity out there that you don't see. At local level, particularly at hyper-local level, there are huge numbers of initiatives, and not all of which are using formal democratic and participative structures, but all of which could be brought into this bigger conversation if we worked with them in the right way. And there's lots of initiatives that are starting to make that happen. The second is, as Mark said, the politics is not always as ambitious as the citizens. Now, citizens sometimes are ambitious in general and cautious in the specifics, but still, there's a lot of narrative that we could build around the sense of common purpose and trying to get things done together. And the third thing is that the number of people who are working on this is constantly increasing as well. So we are not in a situation where we are short of ideas, short of people, short of initiatives. What we are short of sometimes is the sustainability and reliability of resources to enable us to build the design and the other sorts of approaches that help us work over the long term. And we're also sometimes short of some really practical skills. I know that there's a real shortage of trained facilitators for democratic participation. And so one of the things that we could certainly see as a needed piece of support from government, European or national, is to think about how they can provide those long-term pieces of support around training facilitators, building the network infrastructure, supporting digital tools. And it's really positive to see that some of the tenders and framework contracts that are out there right now are explicitly building some of those longer term pieces like digital networks and things into the way in which governments are going to commission participation into the future. But it's still a shaky foundation to build on. I'm an optimist because if you work on democracy and you're not an optimist, I don't know why in the business. But at the same time, I'm very conscious of some of the challenges that are out there and some of the risks if we allow our internal motivation to drop in the face of what sometimes seem pretty difficult external obstacles.
Stefan, I wonder if you want to bring in the perspective from the EU angle in particular.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I would say, just say on the more optimistic side, I guess it is a sort of an optimistic approach to say that the politicians are running behind the citizens when it comes to their understanding of the green transition, because one would then expect that in the midterm to long run, in the long run, that politicians will then actually try to catch up. One would hope, one would argue, but then of course when we go into the specifics, we need to also be aware that the attitudes can change depending on the particular case. So, for example, citizens may say in the polls that they care about environment and climate, but then you have the "not in my backyard" syndrome also. So, for example, going back, if we look at environmental impact assessments and what falls under the Aarhus Convention. It's if an investor is to build a cement installation, you would have citizens be involved, and very often you would probably have like a more critical approach about the environmental impacts of that kind of industrial activity. But let's say we talk about the windmill, that can actually support the green transition. And of course, sometimes it's easier said than done, but citizens may gather and just oppose it because they don't like the sight of a windmill in their vicinity or in the just on the landscape that they used to live without these installations. So then suddenly their, let's say, short-term relative gains outweigh the absolute gains that they are also aware of, but at that point it's these relative gains override anything else that they are aware of, because they just, yeah. So that's, I guess, recognizing the importance of public participation, we just need to be mindful of these challenges, these risks, that citizens may not act as citizens in a pure sense, but more like as sometimes in a more selfish way, try to look at their fragmented interests instead of something which is a common good. And that's also interesting to consider from the perspective of digital, when it's not just about relative gains of gaining more prominence or absolute gains, but actually where there can be misuses and the citizens can be co-opted, or we could have this active intentional disinformation that can actually cause damage to our efforts to achieve the green transition. I think these are the risks, and which shouldn't make us doubt in saying that about the huge potentials and that the crucial role the communities and citizens play in enabling the green transitions for political reasons, for policy making reasons, but we need to account for this as well. And I think the EU level, the EU policies are important, and coupled with other national policies and so forth, this policy intervention is important to make sure that we maximize these benefits from public participation and the use of digital tools for the green transition, and avoid these negative side effects. Now, I mean, we discussed cities and local action and public participation for example, projects under Aarhus. Now we also have EU-level decision-making as part of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and citizen assemblies on that level. So that is a bit trying to connect the EU institutions and EU policymaking with the citizens themselves. And that, for example, I can also see the role for digital, because there you have the geographical distance, where by using these different tools, you can help scale up this citizen involvement, notwithstanding the risks, as I just mentioned, and we need to see what to do about them. Now, I mean, what is another interesting point is how can we use digital tools to inform or raise awareness about environmental topics that can prepare citizens and communities to take more concrete action, be it decision-making or being consulted, adding value to the discussion in that sense, or more specifically, as we discuss about energy communities, that they take part in some more concrete activities that can support the clean energy transition, for example. And in that sense, I'm always curious about the possibilities behind the artificial intelligence that can help to some extent, but it can also, depends how you use it, it can also be biased, and it can lead to other effects where it can steer the discussion in a wrong way based on the data that is uploaded or that it's based its decision on. So that is something that I think is also the importance about this discussion about ethical AI and the AI regulation at the EU level, that needs to take into consideration the ethical aspects, but also in the sense sustainability aspects, sustainable use of AI that can also be used to help citizens to make better decisions, and to ensure that their involvement is for the common good, that it doesn't end up being fragmented and being broken into private interests, nor that it is hijacked by particular vested interests and misusing the whole process in that sense. Just one comment also, what Summer said, indeed, on the Aarhus and the environmental impact assessment. Citizens can't veto a project, but and yeah, in the end, the competent authority makes a decision, and that can be challenged for a number of reasons. But I would say it's also to some extent a political and publicity issue. So if citizens are still against that can raise quite a lot of issues if media follow that, of course, and there can be a green backlash that can again translate in the long run into decisions being made that go against the green transition, even though the competent authorities legally can still go ahead with a project that actually contributes to the green transition. So we need to make sure in a way that citizens are aware and they're on board, and arguably digital tools can help us, but we need EU policies to help steer the way in the right, steer them in the right direction.
Already with one question, there's so many angles that I could pick up on. I was going to use my power as chair just to say, before I relocated to Lilongwe, I have been living in Leuven for over 10 years, and I'm very happy to hear you use it as a good example, because indeed I've been part, just purely coincidentally, nothing to do with my role at the EPC, but part as a citizen of redesigning my street and the neighborhood. And also would indeed recommend looking at the project that Leuven's been part of. I think if I remember correctly, it's Just Nature project, which has involved citizens from the beginning right through the process. I am delighted to be in Malawi while they dig up the street, but at least it's been very, very interesting to be part so far. But what I wanted to reflect on also, this is leading to a question, but in Leuven, right after the last elections for the commune, they did a massive consultation exercise for citizens, really asking citizens what the priorities for this administration should be. And that was on everything, and it was very neatly done, and they used every tool at their disposal to reach as many citizens as they could, and I think they had a pretty good reaction to it. But having that strategy then set by the citizens, i.e., here's me saying I want to see fewer cars on my streets, I want to see more trees in my streets, I want to see more green spaces, etc. When they then put in place a new parking monitoring system, or they completely cut up the city so you can't drive in it anymore, it's very hard for people like me to push back on it when I was the one who said to them right at the beginning of this mandate that they should do it. They then did it in the middle of the legislative cycle, if you like. They put these very big changes in place, and they've given it enough period to then bed in before the next elections. And I think you'll find people who, I was perhaps less cynical than my husband on these points, but actually would now support the parties that pushed this through because of their bravery in pushing through very big decisions at the next elections. That actually any kind of pushback that there obviously was when they put in place such massive changes has diminished as people have seen their quality of life improve, the quality of their surroundings improve. So yeah, I would just like to get your reflections on, from my perspective, it seems clear that you need this overarching strategy, I suppose, to give political cover, frankly, for politicians then pushing through big policy changes, and also especially in terms of the green transition. As we've said, the polling reflects that people want to see ambition here. As Anthony said, I think, yeah, people can be ambitious in general, cautious in the specifics, but actually having that strategy in place to start with is a useful tool in itself. So I wonder if anyone wants to reflect on the value of this sort of wide citizen consultation to start with.
Maybe if I can jump in, I think it's a bit of both.
Sure.
I think you mustn't try to kind of outsource the political pain to citizens. You've got to make sure you're defending your decisions as well. I think it's trying to create the sense of taking decisions together and on the basis of good advice and good deliberation, rather than trying to kind of say, well, it's their fault, blame them. Because I think there is a risk, which we've seen a little bit play out in some places, that even quite a well-designed, effective citizen assembly or something like that, people say, well, I included 150 people. I wasn't one of them. They weren't speaking on my behalf. And obviously, you can get into the thing about, well, actually, it's a representative sample. And if you think about it, they were looking at information and it was all, but there's the old line about in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And I think that, there's definitely a sense that we need to have a really clear narrative that is led by the political leaders who people see as having representative legitimacy, about how they're using deliberative and participative legitimacy as well to build a bigger picture. And I think that that requires neither side to try and step back from its commitments. And that's quite a big ask for politicians. You know, it's a big act of faith for them. And I think sometimes they don't get enough credit for it when it works. For them to say, actually, it's not just for me. You know, I might have spent 20 years trying to get to the position I'm in, but I'm not going to take all of these decisions. We have to do it together. And I think that that's one of the areas where we're hoping over the coming years to work with political parties as well. So that as they are thinking about bringing people into leadership positions or bringing people into politics, they're thinking about the participative training and the skills for using commissioning and working alongside citizen voice that are still going to be needed no matter how extensive citizen participation becomes, because fundamentally, you know, I believe that representative and participative systems are highly complementary rather than competitive. And so we have to create that complementarity. It doesn't happen of its own accord.
Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, I think it's just important to make that quick distinction about the difference between asking people what they think and a deliberative process. So, I mean, for a lot of the things that we know, polling, etc., and for many of the things that I think the digital tools are good for, we tend to get answers that are in line with what people initially thought. So, for example, you can get it's similar to what you get when people go in to vote. You know, you can imagine how the diversity of opinions will spread on a spectrum. The thing about deliberation, even though, and I think this is in a way self-evident based on what we've said so far, but I just want to underline it. The thing about deliberation is if you do it well, and people really are in dialogue with each other, what you can get out of it is a real sense of what people who are informed, who have taken time to think about something, and who have weighed the pros and cons and dilemmas involved, what they think about it. And that's the reason why it can legitimize a political process. But it's not enough to do it. So, Anthony, what you're saying, it's not enough, obviously, that a few hundred people might have gone through something like this if there's no legitimacy to the process as a whole, if no one knows about it, for example. So two reflections. One is that when we look at the climate assemblies done across Europe, and even when we look at this European, the European panels that were done, they didn't get particularly much attention. There are a few exceptions, like the National Assembly in France got a lot of attention, mostly because it was championed by Macron. But a lot of the other initiatives done somehow go under the radar. And if they don't join into a public debate, then it doesn't actually create the legitimacy that the processes are able to create. So there has to be a follow-up in terms of how they are disseminated and communicated. But the other thing that is integral is that they land within the institutions that are asking for the input from citizens. So, like, we've gotten quite good at asking citizens to participate in different types of assemblies, but it is clearly also an area for further work to ensure that there's a capacity building within the institutions using these models, so that we don't just get an output, for example, a list of recommendations, and they don't really go anywhere. And this capacity building, or the follow-up processes in place that are needed for citizens' input to become relevant for policymaking, is something that we're still just learning about. So I don't think this should be looked at as a criticism of any of the processes done. But I think the truth is that for most of the citizens' engagement that's been done, where you've used deliberative methods, there hasn't been a fully formed decision on how to integrate that into the system afterwards. And if we don't learn that, then we will never really reach the potential of what these methods can do for us. And as a final caution, I think we're actually at a stage now where there's been sufficient experimentation where it's no longer enough to just do a good process that some citizens are very happy to have been in. If we don't manage to land them within the policymaking cycle, then we will undermine the credibility of the processes going forward. So there's work to be done in that sense.
Summer, yeah, feel free.
Yes, no, I agree what Mark just said. Right now, we need a framework to make sure that it's not just a wonderful good feeling and wonderful recommendations worked out within this process, but that it then gets transferred back and develops into capacity building measures for for the decision makers. And that's where, for example, this very old example, but it's still ongoing, new example from Austria, I think is so valuable because so Austria wanted to go in the early 90s. It was just a pet project of a couple of residents and a mayor want to go from a pure electricity importer to full energy, so full independence for electricity within a very, very short piece of time. And now, they have just a few years in order to achieve full climate neutrality as regards electricity. And they achieved that absolutely through total use of citizen science, citizen engagement, so it's a strategic environmental impact assessment procedure, Article 7 procedure, which provides the framework for this connection between, they had expert stakeholder meeting groups, which also brought out further things to the general citizenry, and there were town hall meetings. But then there was also quite a lot at that time that it wasn't very digital. It's becoming digital now because it's an ongoing process. And this provided exactly this sort of framework where this input was carried through into the very, very highest level. And it made for decision-making going from a plan to a permit to construction on wind farms within absolutely record time and with great public acceptance, also because they were made to appreciate not just, oh, I like the idea of energy independence in particular, but I also like that I can be connected to the grid myself. So building these energy communities is a very, very valuable way, proven in countries like the US, where you get people invested, involved, and able to sort of understand not just what the pollsters say, oh yes, I want a green transformation, but they see the benefit also directly to them and ways in which the, starting out with something very small can feed into something that's a much larger process. And their citizens also, they gave the information. So it was BirdLife and NGOs and individual people going out and taking measurements, which led to the better siting and mitigation measures for these wind farms. So from top to the bottom, it was really citizen driven. And I think that is an example of a great framework that should be replicated elsewhere, either in its formal sort of strategic environmental assessment context or mimicked in other ways and can be mimicked in other ways concerning other policies.
Yeah, actually, that's a very nice point to get to, because actually my next question was going to be on processes and impact of actions that are organized institutionally, for example, by government, such as European citizens panels or citizen science, or bottom up through civic activism, grassroots movements. I mean, from the rest of you, is one better than the other? Are there lessons that you can learn from one that should be integrated into the other, and so on? Who wants to rise to the challenge? Stefan, go ahead.
Thanks. Well, maybe just briefly to reflect on this, that I think when we talk about top-down from the EU towards the communities, I think it's more about creating this enabling framework that can support citizens to then take action and to be involved in these different discussions and activities, also like on energy production and to consultations and decision-making. And that the EU creates this kind of more like indirect tools coupled with investments, for example, also that can support these activities at the local level. Something more concrete, directive concerns the decision-making at the EU level itself, such as the Conference on the Future of Europe, that can be developed and further and building on what has been done thus far. So that is more like a direct link, I would say. And then it is important for the EU to listen, to observe what is happening spontaneously or a result of enabling frameworks and other levels of governance, local, regional, and so forth. And because, of course, citizens are not just passive respondents. They are creating policies and creating new realities, and the EU is then can use and monitor good practices to ensure that they are scaled up. And just wanted to say, to pick on what was mentioned by Mark and also as well as Summer, I mean, on say taking into account what has been said, and that this ensuring that these the opinions of the citizens then actually are add value or later in the institutional, in this policymaking process. I mean, I would say in that sense, the good example is the case of the Aarhus Convention, because there, when you consult citizens, there is a procedure to ensure that that these opinions are taken into account, and if it's not done properly, you can challenge it in front of the court and so forth. So there is a very strict legal procedure on projects, and I would say also on strategies and action plans, to my understanding, where basically this can't just be like a gathering where they talk about something and it's nothing happening. But arguably this can be scaled up and used for in other cases that don't fall under the Aarhus Convention. Similar mechanisms could be explored to ensure that actually authorities then really translate this, or let's say take into account, as I said, take into account the opinions of the citizens and communities when they are actually creating more concrete policies.
Keeping an eye on time, because somehow we managed to nearly fill the hour and a half that we have. Summer, I'll come to you in a second, but I'd just like to pose to everybody, if you can give your view on what you think the role for data and digital solutions can be in facilitating civic activism. You know, how can they serve as enablers for people's engagement in the green transition? Yeah, you know, I know some of you have touched on it in your introduction, but if you have examples of where, yeah, either good practice or indeed the opposite, be very, very welcome. Summer, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I think I missed the intro, but it actually seemed to sort of feed into a little bit of what Stefan was going towards. You know, sort of how can we facilitate this? I mean, I think there are lessons to be learned, taken from the Aarhus Convention and applied in the non-Aarhus context. But also there's the requirement, when he was speaking earlier, about sort of the need to support and provide advice and facilitate for the public, for them to understand what their rights actually are. That is a provision, Article 3.2 of the Article Convention, and that goes beyond Aarhus rights. That's just what are their rights sort of with regard to the environment, which includes climate, energy, etc. So it's not just, you know, about access to information, public participation, or access to justice, but something much broader. And recently the Compliance Committee had a case on that and showed that obligation has real teeth. And that is something that we should explore further, is this affirmative obligation to educate the public about things. And that's also in Article 3.3 of the Convention, and promoting civil awareness about environmental issues. And I think both should be sort of pushed on, especially as we, I think necessarily, but at the same time, sometimes dangerously, become more digitalized in the way we use civic engagement. So Stefan mentioned a few dangers. I mean, there's harassment, surveillance, there's risks of greater gender and age and socioeconomic gaps associated with increasing digitalization. And it's really critical that we not leave people behind. Digitalization should be a democratizing force, and that's something that we should all work. And you know, I'm working with NGOs, but also the UN, EU actors, local governments should all play their part to inform citizens about their rights, about what the issues are, and support them in those ways, and including some of these existing NICE frameworks that we've spoken of.
Absolutely. I mean, I should say that a lot of these issues we plan to explore in the following meetings of the project, the roundtables that we'll hold, and also the final paper that we'll put together. So yeah, we'll try our best, but you know, all of the input that you've provided during the course of this discussion will be integrated into that, and we will almost certainly be in touch with you to get additional links and information. Yeah, Monika, Anthony, Mark, I don't know whether you want to reflect.
Very quickly, the digital side for me, I think you've got to make sure that, as well as using digital tools where you can to connect up people at local level and also at European and national level, we are making sure that the environment in which those digital tools are used is reliable, and that we have good information, we have good quality, good quality sharing, honesty, transparency of who's actually in the space. We have a project going on at the moment called Knowledge Technologies for Democracy with our partners at King's College Dublin. I encourage you to check out the website. It's very much about how, it's like all Horizon projects, it was written a while ago and now being implemented today. But it's about the use of AI and AI tools, and particularly some of the democratic ways in which you can define the needs and the boundaries for artificial intelligence. So some of those pieces of work are really important alongside the regulatory work the European Union has been undertaking. But it's essential for me, given that digital is going to be inevitably part of the information space for the foreseeable future, that we have a really good quality conversation enabled by digital, using in-person and digital tools at the same time.
Monika, Mark.
I was not sure, should I comment more or not?
Sure.
Sure. So I think by summarizing what everyone said, digital is not magic, and it has to be used in a certain context for a certain group of people to be effective. In a lot of cases, digital is not the answer, although it could support deliberative approaches, like through Zoom, easier connection, and so on. However, in some cases, piece of paper and a talk with a person can make much more change than a creation of a complex digital platform, which is accessible only by those, who are doing the platform, and we have a lot of examples of such platforms created in a variety of European funded projects and otherwise funded projects, which just exist without any input from these citizens. So I think any tool should be considered in the context, and if the context is not fit, digital might not be the only answer.
Yeah, it's hard to come up with a wonderful little red bow we can tie on everything, but I think my message would be that there's tremendous evidence saying that it makes sense to ask and involve citizens. The important thing is to be very conscious, though, about why and on what you're doing it. So it's not for everything that's meaningful to do so, and it's essential also to know when it fits into larger cycles. So, for example, asking someone what they think of a decision after a decision is made is rarely very relevant. So you need to be very conscious of timing things meaningfully. And then the question of how you then engage becomes relevant. So digital tools can certainly do things, but it's really important that you are aware that different things fit for different contexts. So when you know what you want to engage around, you know when it's the right time to do so, you need to design your how around that. How, both in terms of the design of and choice of process and tool, but also very specifically in terms of making clear decisions and distinction on what then is the mandate given and how will it be followed up by whoever has the authority to do so. If you don't take these things into consideration, I don't think it will have much of an impact. However, if you do take them into consideration, you do so rigorously and design for purpose, there is tremendous opportunities for both, I think, creating more ambitious policies, which some people might think is a meaningful outcome, but for at least with a big certainty, creating legitimate outcomes that mirror what people think and care about, which I think is a good place to end.
I would entirely agree. I mean, yeah, there's definitely a lot of questions remaining, at the very least in my notebook here. But it does look like there are some answers that are available, that digital solutions do provide some support and assistance, even if indeed they're not a silver bullet. But as I said before, we'll be taking on this project over the next few months within the EPC. Looking at various aspects. I'll be holding a roundtable on energy communities, in fact, and looking at the digital tools there. If anybody, including in the participants, is interested in feeding into the process, then don't hesitate to get in touch with Stefan or myself. But yeah, all that remains is for me to give a very big thank you to the panelists, because this has been a really interesting discussion. I'm very grateful for your time. And Anthony, I hope you can find a chair at some point. I get the impression you've been standing the whole time.
I've been sitting down for 2 days in the kickoff meeting. To be honest, standing is a pleasure.
Okay, that's good to hear. But no, really, my sincere thanks for your time and for your insights. It's been very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.